everyone. How are you all? You must be exhausted. It's a very, very busy week, but thank you so much for being here, and thank you for the Rockefeller Brothers Fund for hosting us into this iconic location. I want to apologize for Johan Rockstrom, who was on the panel, but he got called by the UN to be inside this morning, and so he sends his apologies, and we are working very closely with him because obviously the planetary boundaries, as we will hear later on, issue is very, very important and related to fashion. It must be quite strange for some of you to be at a fashion panel during Climate Week because this industry has historically been very underrepresented during the climate negotiation. But what we have discovered, building on more than 3 years of investigations by leading NGOs like Changing Market Foundation, Stand Earth, the Geneva Institute for Business and Human Rights, this industry plays a fundamental role into the phase out of fossil fuel. And this means also that the global push, which is gathering now momentum to commit to a fair phasing out of fossil fuels, and all the campaigners who are relentlessly working on this issue and to make sure that we keep coal, oil, and gas on the ground. And we align this agenda to the coming up of COP28. Can't ignore an industry that plays this role. And the global stock assessment, which just got published on whether countries are meeting their emissions pledges made under the 2015 Paris Agreement, recommends the transformation across all sectors and contexts while phasing out of fossil fuels. The phrase, in fact, that is used in the latest IPCC report is rapid, deep, and immediate emission cuts this decade. Means it has to happen now. And the big question is, how on earth do we do that when we're all wearing oil? So, Cami, I want to start with you. Cami Bullins is a program associate to the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, Democratic Practice, Global Challenges, and Sustainable Development Program. You focus on fossil fuel phase-out and transnational movement building. You currently serve on the advisory board of the Youth Climate Finance Alliance, and you are co-chair of the International Grantmakers Network, which is a working group of philanthropy in New York. And I want to start with you because in 2014, the Rockefeller Brothers Fund announced its decision to divest from fossil fuels. And Michael Northrop, you and the entire team at RBF have been at the very forefront of the climate movement, working tirelessly. And yet, when you and I spoke, even you had no idea about the role that the fashion industry plays. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that and how do we keep fossil fuels on the ground with fashion?
Big question. Like you said, I think the fund has been working on climate for a really long time, and we sort of have these buckets that we put things in, and I don't think, thinking through our positioning on climate, keep it in the ground, makes sense for us, and we're pushing forward and supporting organizations who are working towards that goal. But one is falling out of my pocket, sorry. But when we really think about what that requires, I think over the past several years in particular, we have supported policy work and we've supported campaign work that targets specific industries, and we think a lot about, the agriculture industry, we think about the fossil fuel industry itself, we think about all of these other sectors. But like you said, when it comes to fashion, our sort of inroad there was more thinking through, oh, okay, well, this has a little bit to do with the agricultural industry, so we'll take it from this angle, and, it's really affecting kind of displacement and farmers, and that was sort of the perspective we took on it. And so even though we do have a portfolio of work, my colleague Deborah Burke has this incredible portfolio that she's been supporting on petrochemicals. When we had our conversation, and with you as well, George, talking about how much of petrochemical development is actually going towards synthetic manufacturing, my mind was blown. And then it becomes an issue of like, well, we're people who know a lot about this. what does that mean for folks who aren't as deeply involved in the space? And so, we have some partners who have been doing a lot of this work that you're working with, and we're really excited about that. But really thinking about how can we connect the dots has been something that we pride ourselves on, and this was a huge, huge gap for us. And so thinking about connecting those dots, about how we're thinking about how fashion plays into all of these other industries, and how fashion has kind of almost been able to slip under the radar in the broader climate movement's attention towards fossil phase out and keeping things in the ground, and what a just and equitable transition actually looks like. And so, like you said, this isn't something that we're going to be able to do if we don't tackle fashion, and it is something that has such a personal attachment to everyone, because we all are here together wearing clothes. And it's hard to find clothes that don't have petrochemicals in them, that don't have oil in them, and it's really difficult. And so I think we at the fund are just excited that you and your partners are really thinking about how to connect those dots and how to bring all of these pieces together, because there are folks, like you said, who have been working on different pieces of this puzzle over time. But how do we really kind of create a cohesive campaign that people can connect to, and that philanthropy can support moving forward?
Thank you, Cami. And it's an indication of how much jet-lagged I am when I have to read my colleague George's bio. So George Harding-Rolls is EcoAge Head of Policy and Advocacy, and a former campaign manager at Changing Markets Foundation, where you led some really incredible investigations under the Fossil Fashion Program, which unveiled for the first time, really, fashion-heavy reliance on fossil fuel, including direct links between Russian oil and fashion, in a moment where sanctions are imposed. So I want you to tell us what is the issue, first of all, and why do we need the fossil fuel fashion campaign?
Yeah, right, great. So I think it's helpful to kind of split it into two. So firstly, the kind of enormous impact and the enormous footprint of fossil fashion, as we call it, fossil fuel fashion, and the present day fashion industry. And then the second one, what that kind of enables the industry to do and how that plays into the fast fashion business model and the big elephant in the room, which is overproduction, overconsumption. So on the first one, we at Changing Markets, where I was before joining EcoAge, we really tried to go kind of through the whole range of impacts from the fashion industry, right from the wellhead all the way through to waste at the end of life, looking at it through this perspective of over-reliance on fossil fuels, whether that's the fossil fuels for manufacturing, which Rachel at Stand Earth is much more of an expert on, so I'll leave her to talk about that, or the material sourcing itself. So we looked at the policies of companies, we looked at the kind of increasing percentage points every year that they double down on fossil fuels. To contextualize it, Nike and Inditex, the parent company of Zara, they use about 10 million gallons of oil every year to make clothing. Some companies, they make up to 90% of their clothing, sports companies, from oil and gas. So looking at the companies specifically, looking at the sourcing of the petrochemicals of the fossil fuels that are going into fossil fuel derived fibers, polyester, acrylic, etc. So Livia touched on our investigation, Dress to Kill, where we pieced the supply chain all the way back to Russian crude oil, being imported at a discount rate into these two major polyester producers, so Reliance Industries in India and Hongli in China, and then how that finds its way through various intermediaries to many of the world's biggest fashion brands, a lot of whom, the majority of the ones that we reached out to, had actually also pulled operations out of Russia at the beginning of the Ukrainian war because of obviously not agreeing with that, being strictly opposed to it, but still through the back route actually indirectly funding that warmongering effort. So these are dirty fuels. We know fossil fuels are super dirty. What we aren't really acting on is the fact that they're in our clothes, the fact that these fashion brands who like to paint themselves as part of this sustainable future, huge amount of greenwashing going on, don't get me started on that, are also really part of this doubling down of effort by the petrochemical industries into fossil fuels, into synthetics and plastic. And I think for me that is incredibly important. When I was listening to Sephora speak at Gold's House this morning, and she was talking about how, I'm probably going to get the statistic wrong, but we will produce 110% more oil and gas than we can produce in order to stay below 1.5 degrees. But also demand for oil and gas is kind of reaching its peak at the moment, and that's driven by decarbonisation and things like energy and transport. That gap is super worrying, because what the petrochemicals industry is doing is pushing that into plastics and synthetics at an alarming rate. And so it's the cash cow of the fossil fuel industry, whilst we're all distracted by decarbonisation efforts in other industries, which are super important. It's seeping into our clothes, it's seeping into our packaging. There's a BP future energy scenario out to 2040 that assesses that up to 95% of future growth in oil demand will come from plastics, of which synthetics is one. So it's not going away. And then to come to the second point, what does this massive over-reliance on fossil fuels allow the industry to do? I mean, to put it bluntly, fast fashion is predicated on cheap labor and cheap materials. And this cheap materials side of things is polyester, it's acrylic, it's polyamide, etc., which is finding very, very sneaky ways of getting into our clothes. You might see clothes which are like a linen look or like woolen knit, and actually it's made from synthetics. And really, this is why we're going after it. Is if you kick the feet out from under synthetic fibers, what you start to do is unravel the fast fashion system as we know it, because the majority of clothes that these ultra fast fashion companies like Shein, who also announced a partnership with Reliance Industries, that polyester producer sourcing Russian oil, they are made from cheap plastic fibers, and if they can't make them from cheap fibers, they can't continue to sell them at rock bottom prices, and their business model starts to go under. And then you start to kind of circle around to this wider issue of overproduction of clothing. I haven't even got onto the waste issue yet, and that's a whole other thing other people can talk about or find me afterwards. But yeah, a huge amount of the waste issues coming from the fashion industry are to do with the fact that it is plastic in disguise. We did, just a quick stat, we did an investigation in Kenya with Better Man, who sadly couldn't be here today, and we found that 37 million pieces of junk plastic clothing were entering into Kenya every year, and junk because they are too low quality or too broken or damaged to actually be used, so they just get dumped or burnt. And that is the end of the line of fast fashion. It's taken out of the ground in Russian pipelines or elsewhere, and it ends up in the global south being dumped on communities who are the least able to deal with it. I'm sure I've gone over 5 minutes, so I'm just going to pass it back to you, Livia.
No, it starts to make sense, right? How fashion, and we cannot actually phase out of fossil fuels without the fashion industry held accountable for that. And Harjeet, this is a very important topic for the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. So Harjeet Singh, you're a global expert on the issues of climate impacts, migration, and adaptation. You have been supporting countries across the world on tackling climate change, and until recently, you have led ActionAid, international climate change work globally. You are the Global Engagement Director of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative, which is one of our campaign partners today, and we look forward to do a lot of work with them. The Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty is an initiative that spurs international cooperation to end new development of fossil fuels and phase out of existing production, and develop plans to support workers, communities, and countries dependent on fossil fuels. So far, 100 governments from around the world, including the bloc of the Pacific Island nation and the European Parliament, joined. And at the beginning of this month, which made it very exciting, the state of California announced joining the treaty, effectively becoming the largest economy to endorse the call. So, Harjeet, tell us a bit more about where the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty came, how the industry can play that role, and also what is actually the impact of the oil and fashion in some, relating to some of the statistics that George was going on.
Sure. Thank you very much, Livia, for having me in this very important conversation. Before I talk about the fossil fuel industry and the Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative, I want to connect with what George said. I come from India, and ironic, you mentioned about Reliance. It's a big petrochemical company into garments, it's into several businesses. It hails from the same land where Mahatma Gandhi comes from. And I don't know how many of you know, but Mahatma Gandhi actually led a massive protest against industrialized clothing, garment industry as part of the freedom movement and promoting cotton. So you're seeing cotton that I'm wearing right now. And which was to promote local production, local economy, and local industry. And Reliance is walking exactly in the same direction what Gandhi wanted us to take. So it's really ironic. And we also need to connect that with the whole issue of demand and supply, which George, you briefly talked about. So how we, based on our demands, have created this massive industry which is causing huge damage to the environment. And when we talk of fossil fuel industry, we need to also understand the climate crisis that we are facing. It's the fossil fuels that are at the root cause of this crisis. And can you imagine that over the last 30 years, we have not even talked about fossil fuel, the core cause? The convention does not mention coal, oil, and gas. The Paris Agreement does not even refer to fossil fuels. We only talk about reducing emissions. And without having a single word coming on how we look at the supply, from where this problem is originating and how we deal with the complexity of that, because you have economies dependent on it. You have millions of workers whose job depends on fossil fuel. Energy, millions still do not have, hundreds of millions do not have access to energy. And how the Western promoted so-called development model has pushed even the developing countries to just follow that blindly, and fashion industry is very much part of it. So the kind of momentum that we have seen in the last 2-3 years with COP26 in Glasgow, where we found just a mention of coal, and that too with a lot of riders and unabated coal and inefficient subsidies. We are nowhere there. But at the same time, Livia, as you mentioned about the treaty, we are actually getting a massive momentum in terms of 100 cities that you mentioned and governments coming forward. And that's the need of the hour. We need to have that conversation in a very comprehensive manner, because as I said, jobs and economies are dependent on it. And now that we are talking about how the fashion industry is using fossil fuels so much and it's so unsustainable, we would like the fashion industry to come on board and understand the pillars of this fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty, where we are saying stop expansion and phase out of fossil fuels equitably, and we should do that through a just transition. And those same principles also apply to the fashion industry. And we want fashion industry to be proactive in its approach in terms of engaging and not reactive, because that's the direction of travel we have to take. You talk about new regulations, you talk about consumer awareness, you talk about the impacts, and I'm sure Rachel is going to talk a lot more about the supply chain. We have that's the direction we are supposed to be taking, and we cannot let fashion industry off the hook. You can be a partner in our efforts towards sustainability, and especially with the kind of awareness that's there. Solutions are there, but we have to look at all levels of emissions to make sure that you are not just doing a superficial action, but you are looking at the entire supply chain. Again, I'll let Rachel talk about it. But we would like to see fashion industry really becoming a partner in this journey and support the work that we are doing as Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative, so that we have a whole governance system, because we cannot just expect individuals to do it. And fashion is one such thing. When you don't have options available, and thankfully I come from India where cotton is so easily available and it's not as expensive as we find in many other places, we are able to access that. So consumers can make that choice, but that's not true in many countries. So how do we make sure that consumers make right choices? That's why you need right kind of policies and frameworks from local to global levels. And I'm happy to explain more in the conversation, but I'll let others come in.
Thank you, Harjeet. Rachel, over to you. Rachel Kitching, climate campaigner for fossil-free fashion at environmental NGO Stand Earth. One of our campaign partner working to kick fossil fuels out of the fashion and tech industry supply chain. Stand Earth has been leading the work on climate. For a number of years, they've been working on an equitable decarbonization of fashion supply chain. And recently, you produced the fossil-free fashion scorecard, which is a measure of commitments and actions taken by brands to decarbonize their supply chain, which is very interesting because, Harjeet, what you were talking about, proactive rather than reactive. So I think in terms of commitment, we have heard a lot of commitment, but thanks to Stand Earth and the work that they've done with the scorecard, we discovered that a lot of the commitments, like to be kind, completely empty and greenwashing. I urge everyone, actually, tomorrow Stand Earth is going to host a panel online called Beyond Decarbonization. The fashion industry needs an equitable and rapid transition that avoids false solution, which is very, very important, with another fossil fuel fashion campaign partner, Professor Hakan Karaosman. And this is a very, very important part of the conversation about just transition. So Rachel, over to you about, talking about the scorecard, what you discovered, and also to explain a little bit about all this complicated supply chain of fashion that many people in the climate movement don't know.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, so I guess I kind of wanted to give a little bit of background about how Stand Earth came to produce the fossil-free fashion scorecard, because Stand Earth is a climate organization with really deep supply chain expertise, a lot of experience in moving corporations and big corporations from across a lot of different industries to set stronger climate commitments and to really move the needle on climate action from corporations. We also have a Stand research group, which has a ton of expertise and kind of really diving deeply into following the path of supply chains into areas where sometimes even the brand themselves doesn't necessarily know. So in 2017, when Stand kind of came to look at the fashion industry, it was a very different landscape, and there were no brands with climate commitments that touched their Scope 3 emissions, their supply chain emissions, which accounts for around 98% of the brand's emissions. All the fashion companies were talking about was things like energy efficiency in their stores and headquarters, renewable energy in stores and headquarters, which only touched a tiny proportion of their emissions. So Stand saw a gap, but also a huge opportunity. This is a multi-trillion-dollar industry with supply chains that are heavily located in the global south, in parts of the world where coal, fossil fuels absolutely dominate the electricity grids. And these companies have a lot of power, a lot of purchasing power, and a lot of presence to be able to significantly catalyze new development of renewable energy and a global shift away from fossil fuels. However, that was not currently within the game plan. So Stand kind of started this campaign where we aimed to shift a company into a leading position on Scope 3 emissions, with the goal that that would catalyze growth across the industry. And we did. We targeted Levi's to begin with a supply chain investigation, which was able to show how the emissions produced in their supply chain was harming people, and the same people who were working in their factories, producing the clothes that produce their profits. And that harm comes from the burning of coal on site in factories, and the massive reliance on fossil fuels for electricity within their supply chains. And when we pushed Levi's and they set the first example of real Scope 3 commitments in their supply chain, that catalyzed a movement across the industry. And now you can see that hundreds of companies are setting targets, and many of the largest fashion brands in the world are setting these targets. But of course, as we know, targets and commitments only go so far. So that's kind of the birth of the Fossil-Free Fashion Scorecard, which aimed to take a really deep dive into where fossil fuels are located in supply chains and to benchmark what companies need to be doing in order to phase out fossil fuels completely. So the scorecard sets up targets across several key areas. The first being renewable energy and energy efficiency, including what brands are doing in their supply chains to advocate for new renewable energy, to decarbonize the grids where their supply chains are located. We also looked at what they're doing to phase out fossil fuel-derived materials, because, of course, fabrics and synthetic fibers are a huge proportion of that emissions and another kind of lever for the fossil fuel industry. And we also looked at what companies are doing to transition to zero-emission shipping, because shipping, it's not a huge percentage, but around 10% on average of a brand's emissions come from just shipping its goods across the world into our hands in the West and our stores. And even more if they rely on aviation, which many did during the pandemic. So what we really found is that a lot, as Livia mentioned, a lot of these commitments were getting bigger, but when you stripped away the kind of PR and sustainability marketing, there is not a huge amount of measurable action within supply chains and where it counts with supply chain actors in order to actually catalyze that transition. We found in terms of support for suppliers to shift to renewable energy, to pay for the kind of energy efficiency measures that need to be happening. In our latest scorecard, less than a quarter of the companies that we looked at were reporting any kind of support, whether that's information or any kind of financial support for their suppliers, who are the ones that have to bear the burden of decarbonization. When it comes to, maybe just a little bit of background for those who don't know, one of the major causes of pollution and carbon emissions in the supply chain is from coal burned on site to produce heat for dyeing, drying, steaming, all these kind of different processes. And the tier 2 of manufacturing, where a lot of these processes are happening, accounts for around 52% of emissions on average. And there are 10,000 coal boilers in Bangladesh alone. So this piece around the coal phase out is such a hugely relevant to the fashion industry. It's so important, and I think that's why we as the climate organization and all of us are here. It's really happening. It's so relevant, and it really needs action to address it. I think another kind of finding that I found interesting, Standearth did some research a couple of years ago deep research into Lululemon's supply chain. So where they were sourcing goods from, how much was coming from each country. We looked at the kind of grid mix and the emissions intensity of each of these countries, found that only 5% of their products that are on sale are made with renewable energy. So that's 95% fossil fuels. And that's pretty standard across the industry. So whether you're wearing polyester or not, your clothes are made with fossil fuels. I think it speaks to the impact of our work and the impact of the report that Lululemon put out its impact report a couple of days ago saying that actually 15% of their clothes are made with renewable energy. I mean, that's better. It needs work. And there's still a hugely long way to go in terms of transparency across the industry to see what else is happening to make that shift away from fossil fuels and towards renewable energy. And a huge amount of investment still needed. But we are really proud of the impact that the scorecard continues to have. And I think, sorry, I know I'm talking a long time.
No, but it's fundamental because these are all things that, it are so difficult to understand. And Standearth is one of the biggest research that, this campaign is based upon. And,
Yeah.
so
It's complicated
It's
stuff.
so complicated. It's complicated stuff. Everything will be on the, obviously on the Stand Earth website.
Absolutely.
And on the Fossil Fuel Fashion Campaign website as well.
Yeah, and I just wanted to make one more quick pitch around our Just Transition webinar tomorrow, because,
Yeah.
you know, as we were saying, like, the scorecard, the landscape is evolving, and so is the fossil fuel fashion scorecard. You know, we're really trying to build in new elements which benchmark how brands need to be engaging with a just and fair, equitable transition away from fossil fuels within their supply chain. And we are going to dig into more of that tomorrow.
Yeah, and Professor Hakan Karosman is a pretty cool guy, so I urge everyone to go and listen to that podcast. So we're starting again, like the overview start deepening and widening, and you know, this incredible supply chain of fashion that starts from all the way from agriculture and ends up all the way to a landfill. And you know, the cost of overproduction and overconsumption of fashion is, you know, the impact is devastating on the global south. I want to give you just a couple of daunting examples. One that George mentioned, but for example, only in Ghana, Kantamanto market, every week, 15 million items of discarded clothing arrives. 15 million a week. And they get burned. They're made of oil. And I let you imagine the devastating impact on the local community in terms of health and pollution and everything else. George mentioned the investigation of changing market called Strachan. They revealed that 37 million items of junk plastic clothing from the EU that end up in Kenya every year. And I'm very sorry that our panelist, Betema Simidi Musasa from the organization Clean Up Kenya, couldn't make it to New York, but the US didn't grant him the visa because they didn't believe that he would have gone back home. So instead of being here with us, he sent us a video that I hope our amazing technical team can show us now.
My name is Betaman Simidi Msasian, and I'm the founder of Clean Up Kenya. We are based in Nairobi, but work nationally. We have been in existence for the last 8 years. During this time, we have conducted numerous cleanups all across the country. Some of these have involved children and youth as part of our educational programs. We are also doing a lot of advocacy work around different issues related to waste management. And often we collaborate with different entities in the country and abroad. Countries in the global south continues to have great challenges in the management of textile waste. This is mainly enabled by the global fashion industry through the unregulated second-hand clothing trade. In 2021, for example, the United Kingdom and the EU exported to Kenya 500 40-foot containers of second-hand clothing. About 40% of these were found out to be simply rubbish, either being climate or culturally inappropriate, or being too damaged or soiled to be reused. This only represents a small fraction of the second-hand clothing coming to the global south from the global north, as other countries like the United States, China, Canada also sent in significant shipments. Because of the way the global second-hand clothing trade is structured, we have been able to demonstrate that countries like Kenya manage the end of life of clothing made by the global fashion industry. Unfortunately, countries in the global south like Kenya do not have the necessary textile recycling or waste management infrastructure to manage the end of life of what the global fashion industry produces. This means the clothing made by the fashion industry ends up on our rivers where they are washed to sea, or on our regulated dump sites where they undergo open-air incineration. And this has real impact on the environment and our fragile communities. As a leader from the global south, I'm deeply concerned about the impact the global fashion industry has on the planet and our communities. I'm also concerned that clothing is now increasingly being made from fossil fibers, which contributes greatly to environmental degradation. I'm also concerned that not much policy attention has been put on the impact of fossil fashion on the planet. I'm also deeply concerned that fashion brands continue to skirt around this problem with fake circularity and sustainability claims. I, however, hope that my voice can amplify these problems and help build a fair and just society for all.
So now, although the EU is finally legislating on fashion waste, and recently, a couple of weeks ago, Uganda announced the banning of textile and second-hand imports to bolster their local apparel production. This just scratched the surface of both a fair phasing out of fossil fuels and exploitation of the global south. Vanessa, over to you. Vanessa Nakate, your reputation precedes you, so much so that you have been nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize this year, and it's wonderful. And you know, what we've been talking about here is climate action, but climate action without equity, climate action without the consideration that we're talking about people. Fashion also is an industry that is made of people, and it's one of the biggest employers of slave labor worldwide. In fact, fashion could be even the poster child of exploitation, of the global north exploitation of the global south, both in production, manufacture, and dumping. So what is the impact on the ground? What do you see? How do you see this issue?
Thank you so much, Livia. I'll start by saying at the march on Sunday, I think, there's a placard that said that even the introverts are here. It must be this serious. And I kind of related with that because that's how I've always been. And actually, my head has just been playing games with me. It just kept saying, you're coming next, and all eyes are going to be on you. And I choose to ignore that and look at the bigger fight or the bigger picture. And that's how it has been for me in my activism. So someone may actually ask, what is Vanessa doing on a panel on fashion? It's because it's serious. I know I'm not the most fashionable icon, but
she says with the blue hair and
We sort of dress like
so is
my
elegant.
But I think this is such a serious situation, and I'm really glad that I was invited to be on this panel. I've grown up, remembering my childhood, I was always so excited about watching fashion shows. And I think that is one of the channels that I watched a lot growing up, in that it got in my head to think that I could actually walk the runway because I could watch it on TV. And I always got excited to see every outfit that was being shown by the models on the runway. But I didn't know the problems that actually came with, the constant fashion shows and how much clothing was being made. Because also, I think when I was a child, I remember the time when my parents would get us new clothes, it would be for Christmas. So there was a value that came with every new cloth that you had. There's a story that came with every new cloth that you had. And there was a life that came with it. And I think that is what always excited me when I would watch these shows because maybe my childhood self thought that maybe people also get these clothes once every year, maybe for Christmas. So you realize that our parents probably didn't have the term sustainability in their minds, but they actually practiced it, and they embedded that in our values and as we grew up. But now, getting into climate activism and starting to understand the impact of fashion, I realized how I was, in this kind of bubble of the fashion world while growing up, and thinking that it was, this magical, beautiful thing that was happening in the world, because I think that is how fashion has been portrayed. In that, if you have the, most trendy thing, you're the coolest person. If you're going to school, if you have, the latest clothes, you're the coolest person. We've probably seen that being shown in the movies that we've watched, in some schools that, we've gone to. The schools that I went to, we had to wear uniforms. So even if you had the latest, there's nowhere to show it. So I think that now I see the problem that comes with a lot of, production and also the consumption, because I've seen that in my country as well. I think those clothes that are brought in countries like Uganda, they're called bells, so they're like second-hand clothes. So if you walk, for example, to a market, today, and you have, let me say, 50,000 Uganda shillings. I can't calculate that right now in dollars, but if you had 50,000 Uganda shillings and you walk through the market where they're selling the second-hand clothes, you can actually end up buying like 50 clothes, because there's this excitement of how cheap they are, and there's this excitement of, I want this blouse, I want this skirt, I want, these trousers. And then when you get them home, you realize that you got excited because of how cheap they were, but you actually don't need the clothes. Because many times we are also told that to be sustainable, we need to buy second-hand. But also second-hand, in a way, becomes problematic because it's coming at a very cheap cost, and it's bringing this kind of impulse buying, I think, if that's the word. So you end up buying more than you need. So I think that, even as we talk about sustainable fashion, you should go beyond, buying second-hand or giving clothes a new life. Again, but it should be about getting what we actually need, because even the second hand, in the process, it becomes very problematic, because it ends up in landfills, because many people don't even wear those clothes. And again, like you've listened from the video, those clothes come in huge numbers, and they always come to countries in the global south. So I think that is it's very problematic, and that's why we need the fashion industry to strongly, be a part of this climate movement, because we can't talk about a just transition, we can't talk about, a better world, a cleaner world, when we know how much harm fast fashion is, causing to our communities, how much pollution, how much wastage, how much exploitation of labor is happening. Because sometimes even when you think about, the people who make our clothes, I think sometimes they are not given as much the respect that they deserve. It's like the farmers. People usually don't think about the people who grow the food that we eat. because you can easily access it. For example, in a supermarket, you may not actually think about everything that was done to ensure that those sweet potatoes or that matoke, was grown, and many times we forget about the person who actually brought that plant to life. And I think it goes back to the clothes. When you can easily access them in a shop or at a mall, you may not think about the person who is actually giving life to those clothes. And I think if we start to bring the faces of the people who actually make our clothes, just like the people who grow our food, I think it will help us in understanding that, if I buy more than what I need, then I am, in the process, I am contributing to the harm that is happening to this person. But when we say no to fast fashion, for example, if we say no to fast fashion as a collective, as a movement, and push for, fashion companies to actually, address the injustices within the fashion industry, to address the pollution, the wastage, and their emissions, I think we can be able to have the transformative change, not just for our planet, but also for the people that make the clothes that we wear. Because sustainability, I think for me, sustainability it's not just about where you buy. I think it's about considering the whole supply chain and understanding where the cloth starts from and how it gets to you. Like, to understand that whole process, I think that can help us know whether this fashion company is being sustainable or not. Because we've seen so many campaigns by many fast fashion companies that, pass off as sustainability, and yet, it is greenwashing. I remember when I just joined, activism, I remember one of those big fast fashion companies, they sent me an email and asked me to be a part of this, sustainable, it was a sustainable line, that's how they called it. And when you're new, like in activism, you're young. I mean, activism is, everything about climate change was very new to me. You don't know what is wrong and what is right. But I had people that, I was able to ask, for guidance. What do you think about this company asking me to do this? And they said, actually, that is a fast fashion company, and they're very problematic with, with their workers, with how they produce their clothes, and that is greenwashing. But I didn't know that, because they don't portray it as that, and I think they approach new young activists who don't have much information about what actually a sustainable, fashion company is, and they approach with thousands of dollars, by the way. So they are so tempting in that they'll make you think that they are sustainable. They want your face, in their brand, and they're ready to pay any amount to show that they are sustainable. And that's why I think that we need to create like a lot of awareness, because I think one of my fellow activists who didn't know that they were actually problematic, because they can't tell you who they have reached out to, so you just kind of find yourselves that, oh, you actually did this campaign as well, you did this. But then when we told him after seeing the post, he was so sad, because he didn't know that, it was a fast fashion company. He was young, much younger than me. So they are actually approaching very young activists to try and make them, be either like faces for their brands, and they're ready to pay any price. So as much as we push them, we push those companies for systematic change. I think we also need to create more awareness. We need to educate more people to understand what is actually sustainable and what is not sustainable, because everyone is trying to show that they are sustainable, and many people don't know that. And finally, usually when I go to, rallies and marches, I always say, we cannot drink oil, and I will say the same thing for, fashion. We cannot wear oil because it's problematic to our planet, to our people, and mostly to the communities that are on the front lines of the climate crisis. Thank you.
Thank you, Vanessa. Thank you for talking to the issue of consumerism and greenwashing. Today has become so insidious and so sophisticated. Hakan Karaosman, who's speaking on the panel tomorrow, even coined the term social offsetting for some of these fast fashion brands. Last year, Shein, for example, made a huge donation of $50 million to an NGO in Ghana to tackle the issue of waste. And I was like, well, there's only one way to tackle the issue of waste is don't send the waste and don't produce so much. You don't need 50 millions to do that. I want to go back to the campaign and why it's exciting that now if government and the climate movement understand the urgency of involving the fashion industry in the phasing out of fossil fuel, then we bring the issue on a different level. The campaign has very specific asks. I'll go back to you, George, to give us the 3 asks of the campaign. I ask our wonderful technical team to put the slide of the 3 asks so it's very clear. And over to you.
Well, it's good that it's there, because otherwise they won't forget it. So the fair phase out of fossil fuels from fashion industry, both in the materials side of things. So the Changing Markets Foundation, their recommendation is based on a 2021 baseline, a 25% reduction in fossil fuel-based materials by 2025, and a 50% reduction by 2030. When we started the campaign, we didn't think that was particularly reasonable necessarily, super ambitious, but not reasonable. But there are brands already on their way to that. So Reformation last year committed to an even more ambitious target than that, which is great. And there's other ones kind of in the running. On the supply chain side, the UN Net Zero Integrity recommends a 55% reduction in supply chain emissions by 2030 to keep below 1.5 degrees. And then the third one, which I think is the most important one, we can no longer do this in a voluntary way as the fashion industry and across different sectors. We've tried, this is my own particular kind of soapbox that people get very bored of me talking about, but we've tried voluntary sustainability for as long as sustainability has existed as a term, and we are where we are today. What we need to try right now is policy and mandatory sustainability, so that looks like legislation, proper regulation of that legislation. In the fashion industry, we're seeing a tidal wave of legislation come down the pipeline, a lot of brands kind of scrabbling around to work out what that means for them. In New York State, where we are right now, we've got the Fashion Act. I think Maxine is there somewhere. There she is. Absolutely spearheading that. So, we're seeing the ingredients of a new system come into play, and I think the role of companies in openly supporting that systemic legislation and not lobbying to water it down, because that's something that we see behind the scenes, often after the fact. Maxine can tell you about that as well. That is critical, and that's what will enshrine this new system and stop us from backsliding. So those 3 asks, there's a lot more details on them, but catch me at the end if you want to talk about it.
The campaign will be long-term. We have various appointments already this year. We're going to be in Brussels in mid-October. We're going to be at COP. Then next year we start again. So it will be unstoppable. We have more and more organizations joining. If anyone wants to join, please go on the website of the Fossil Fuel Fashion Campaign and come on board with us. We have a few minutes for a Q&A. Vanessa talked about introverts. I hope you're not introverts too much to be afraid to ask questions. I know that, I don't know, Maxine, maybe if you are, I don't know where Maxine is because I'm blind as well. There you go. I don't know if you want to talk quickly about the Fashion Act and, you know, what people can do about that or where we are with that, but, you know, no pressure for you to start. We have another question. We have Phil. We have Phil Bloomer, who already warned me that he was asking a very difficult question. So, Maxine, do you want to start and then we pass to Phil?
Sure. I was so pleased to...
Sorry, for the audience, can each one of you introduce themselves?
Sure. Okay. I was not expecting this, so I was really excited.
You know me.
I was excited to just be in the audience, but thank you. Hi, everybody. Maxine Beda from the New Standard Institute, and just a very proud part of the coalition that's just working to pass the Fashion Act in the state of New York. It is very much in line with these commitments right here, and there are lots of people in the audience that are a part of this coalition, so I'm seeing everybody, lots of great friends. But it would require that companies set and achieve science-based targets. So, and it would require companies that are selling into the state of New York. So it's a New York piece of legislation. We had representatives from the senator who's leading the prime sponsor, who's in the room, but I think she had to take a call. But it is a state piece of legislation that would have global implications. I think the best parallel in the US context is to think about what the California fuel efficiency standards did to the global auto industry and kind of kicked off the EV revolution. So we need to do it. We're super excited and pleased to have coalition members right there on stage. It's going to take a global effort. We have leading brands that are also a part of it. I think that it's really great to see leadership from industry coming and saying we need to be regulated. The only way that we can do this is if it's a level playing field, and we can't do it. We can't do it alone. So we're pleased to have a really broad coalition coming together and advancing the Fashion Act. And thank you so much for allowing the time to make that space.
Thank you, Maxine. Okay, we're going to have Phil Bloomer. Yeah.
Thanks very much. Phil Bloomer from the Business and Human Rights Resource Centre. Just, first of all, congratulations. It was really inspiring to hear all that, and it's extraordinary what the campaign, I think, is capable of doing as it goes forward. I suppose my question to you is really about this whole issue of regulation, because as you all have recognised, the voluntary action is only going to take us so far, and that issue of actually using the best practice to raise the minimum floor of corporate behaviour is important. We've seen it as so important in terms of the harm that's done to women workers in the supply chains, but we now need to do the same in this area of fossil fuel and the carbon emissions. So, and I think the point that you made, Maxine, is critically important in terms of the level playing field, but then also that new regulation really driving the innovation that's necessary. Without the regulation, these sods won't innovate in terms of reducing their emissions. So it's critical that we get that. And I suppose my question is, what do you see as the key acupuncture points for the smart regulation, and perhaps even smart business incentives, if that's what does the trick, but the smart business regulation and the smart business incentives that will really drive the change that we need so rapidly over the next 5 years? Thanks very much.
George, over to you.
Yeah.
I can just open by saying that we're very lucky because the EU is starting to regulate heavily across all sectors. And one of the campaign objectives is to put together all the various MEPs and working on the different regulations, the Forced Labor Ban Directive, the Waste Directive, the Eco-Design Directive, the microplastic, to make sure that they all understand that they are part of one issue, because currently they're all working, separate from each other. But George has very strong ideas about what is the most effective way to operate, which is the regulation that will solve the whole issue.
Do I? Well, okay, I'll talk about something that I was thinking about on the plane over, actually. But in terms, I really like that point around kind of acupuncture points, like being super targeted, and it suggests It suggests a focusing of effort rather than a big scattergun approach. And I think particularly looking at the waste element of it, we can't recycle ourselves out of the plastics crisis, we cannot recycle ourselves out of the fashion waste crisis. But I think one of the things we really need to see scale is fibre-to-fibre recycling technologies, because there's only a certain amount that kind of reuse and repair and rental, etc., can get us to. And then also involving within that conversation the investor angle, because one of the big blockers at the moment is just scaling these technologies. And then when you bring in the policy angle, a lot of what investors are looking at is policy green lighting, to know that this is something that's going to be enshrined in the future, that's got a kind of long-term, long tail on it. So it's not going to be this company they invest in suddenly, goes bankrupt tomorrow or can't pull through on its promises. And it's this kind of game of cat and mouse, because obviously you need investment in order to get the technologies there, but then the investment needs to come because there's policy green lighting. And I think that's when working with companies really comes in on their advocacy side. And that's why I was so sort of thrilled, opportunity of a lifetime, to come and work as Director of Advocacy at EcoAge, to work with these companies to understand their role in support of systemic legislation, will help them get investment, will help them scale these technologies of tomorrow, these kind of ingredients of a future system that has yet to come into play. And going back to that point before about when we started this campaign, and it was a bit kind of doom and gloom really, because there weren't really that many solutions on the horizon. But right now we do see these kind of bubbling up from the niche of whether it's grassroots activism taking this issue to heart, or whether it's the solutions, the companies that are saying, actually no, you can produce really high performance sportswear out completely plastic free. These are the things that get me out of bed in the morning and are really exciting, but it has to be married into that policy question so that it's enshrined and it doesn't backslide. So less one specific piece. I think the piece I'm most excited about at the moment, or that is the most sort of timely, I think, are the amendments to the Waste Framework Directive in the EU. And that's, looking at the issue of textile waste and kind of shipments of textile waste into the global south. That's something we're working on super importantly. But that piece, and my wonderful colleague Philly is in the audience somewhere. She's there on her phone.
She's passing the mic.
No, she's got the mic. Sorry, I'm blind. I can't
We
see.
all multitask.
But she's brilliant at working out what are the gaps in this. Like how do these things pull together so they are tackling that overproduction, overconsumption element in the room, whether it's through the fossil fuels line, through the cheap labour line, human rights line, and just making sure we're all like headed in the same direction rather than scattergunning off in different approaches. Acupuncture, not massages.
And Phil, we need you badly to join the campaign, because obviously the forces to be a legislation, I don't need to tell you, the lobbying from big oil, whether it's synthetic or whatever, and from business. Fashion businesses don't want to be regulated. This is an industry that is notoriously totally unregulated. And so we need to be very vigilant and advocate instead of lobbying, as I learned the good word for trying to convince people to do the right thing is. So please join the campaign and we'll work together on that. Any other questions? Oh, Rachel, yes.
Maybe just come in quickly on another aspect of it, which is around the supply chain, the manufacturing emissions. But I think the key piece of that needs to be in this legislation, which I'm really excited about, is around that, yes, the target setting, but the requirement of a pathway to achieve the emissions reductions. And being forced to publish how you intend to achieve your goal with short-term, incremental, year by year, this is what we will achieve, is going to be hugely influential in actually facilitating that change. Because we know that when we get down to it, the AII produced this fantastic report, and WRI, which said, this is the first thing you do. Renewable energy will abate 27% of the emissions. The next step is around coal, it's like really step by step. And the most important thing is that transparency from brands in how they're going to achieve it. And that, I think, will catalyze a huge and important shift.
And that is what is fundamental also for the campaign, to have partners like yours, because Stand Earth is working very closely with the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty to create that transparency. And so one of the things that the campaign can ask is every fashion brand or every manufacturer has to join the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty and work with Stand Earth to achieve that.
And if I can say a line or two, when we talk about regulation, and this is the reason we have to coordinate things at the international level, but it's unfortunate that despite having all kinds of language, sector-wide emissions, economy-wide emissions, then we have that language in Paris Agreement and many subsequent decisions. But the reality is that the way governments and corporations are in bed with each other, they have not allowed that language to be actually translated into action. And the reason we go to these international forums so that we can coordinate, so that it's not that one part of the industry or one part of the world is actually negatively affected by the other part, which is actually taking good, right, ambitious actions. So that you can keep that competitive spirit, yet you move together. And that's why we, as Treaty Campaign, could clearly see a massive gap in terms of looking at the supply side of the story and being complementary to Paris Agreement. So you can talk about reducing demand, but unless you talk about supply and look at the entire chain and look at what kind of challenges are there, and then coordinate efforts, and exactly what Rachel said, have a plan. Nobody is saying you stop everything today, because we also know the way societies are dependent on it. Abrupt stop, which means that it's going to cause social, economic disruption, which we don't want. But where is the plan? And that global framework is missing, and that's why we need a treaty. We need a conversation around fossil fuels, as I said earlier, because your jobs, economies, and energy are dependent on it, and how do you do it in a phased manner? And particularly taking into account, poor communities and workers who are dependent on it.
For sure. I mean, if you speak to any garment worker anywhere in the world, they will say, please don't stop buying, just demand that we are paid a living wage and we work in, under fair conditions. I think we can take one more question. Stephen.
Hello.
I promise we'll get to you too, if we keep it like.
I'll be quick. My name is Stephen Dunbar-Johnson. I work at the New York Times. Actually, what I'd really like to do is be the head of Vanessa Nakate's fan club, but that's for another life. Nice to see you, Vanessa. My question is about unintended consequences. When you talk about cotton, for example, and the image of Gandhi and the loom, it's a very powerful one. But there's also the image of the Aral Sea, which is one of the largest inland water lakes, which is no longer in existence as a direct result of irrigating cotton, and a very water-intensive industry it is. So I just wonder how, as we're transitioning and thinking about all of this and the materials that are required to replace petrochemicals, how are we thinking about unintended consequences going forward?
Yeah, George, do you want to take this?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm really glad you asked that question, because this is not a naturals versus synthetics debate, and I think any kind of straying into that territory misses the wider point. The going after the fossil fuel derived fibres is because that is the lifeblood of fast fashion. It's not then to replace it. We cannot replace it with synthetics. There's not enough arable land on the planet. There's not enough fresh water on the planet. A lot of these fibres are also highly reliant on petrochemicals from pesticides and fertilizers. But what keeps fashion cheap is the fossil fuel derived fibres. So currently, well, actually, I think it was in the year 2000 that cotton and polyester were at parity in terms of cost per kilo, and cotton currently costs twice as much as polyester per kilo. So if you take out the synthetics question, not entirely obviously, because that is not going to happen for a very, very long time until we have a lot of innovation, fashion starts to get more expensive. The overproduction problem starts to diminish. You start to pay for the clothes in terms of the full value of how they're made, start to be able to pay a living wage to, we were talking to a fashion designer earlier today, and her clothes are expensive, it's luxury fashion, but she's able to, with that extra margin, actually pay a living wage to those who are making her clothes. So it's viewing it through the lens of fossil fuel derived fibres to get to that deeper elephant in the room point of overproduction and unraveling that fast fashion, ultra fast fashion business model, which is causing so much harm.
Do you want to? Yeah. We need to
one here
because I think
waiting patiently.
Okay, sorry. I'm a terrible moderator of this.
Does this work?
Yes.
Oh, okay, great. So my name's Maria. I come from a company called Simplifiber. I hear all of what you're saying because I was a luxury fashion designer for 24 years. I left a very successful career because I really realized that our supply chain needed to be changed. So what we're doing as a company is redesigning the supply chain so that it's easier to use natural fibers in a more direct system. So it's kind of akin to using natural fibers and injection molding with them to make clothing, accessories, shoes. I'm actually wearing the first shoes to come off our production line. And what I would like to know is, as a startup founder with a new technology like this that could be very impactful to the whole industry and entire soft goods industry, what available help is there to bridge that gap from, as we start to scale, to really getting into mass, getting into really impact the industry at a large scale and work with very big companies?
Well, one part of the campaign website and work also will be to centralize all the solutions so that George spoke about investors, and also brands can look at that and use it as a resource center. Mm-hmm. So hopefully you are going to join the campaign too.
Absolutely.
There's, we can speak about it earlier, but there's a big fashion investment fund, engagement fund, going to be launched next year by a major European asset manager. Mm-hmm. And I think we're seeing a couple of those different things come up, like a lot of capital being made available to usher in that new system. Yeah. And I think that's when kind of engaging with the advocacy side, sticking your head above the parapet, as I'm sure you are, like as much as you possibly can, but into that policy framework as well is really, really valuable.
Can I say just one line? The impact investment sector has grown really well. Mm-hmm. I would not say it's perfect, but at least there are some right impact investors who are not looking at 20x and 50x profits. Yeah. But they are coming forward and supporting these kind of ideas. So that's another new whole sector to be explored.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Unfortunately, we have to close the Q&A because we have to, like a couple of us have to run to other things, including me, and I apologize. I have to go and open a movie on Texas, which is the biggest producer of oil and gas in America, so it's a good thing. But we can all meet everyone in the auditorium. We have cocktail, like drinks, please. I'm sure we all need to get drunk this week, every single night. And we are all here for questions, and then, get in touch with any of us. All the campaign partners are on the website, and we will happily redirect everyone to where they have to.